Hello, this is episode 21, Humanity and Hope. This is going to be last in the series for Life of the Past, and this actually deals as much with the past as it does with the future. And so we're going to talk about the history of humanity, and we're going to talk a little bit about, where humanity may be going. And so this is an opportunity for you to listen and learn and to, become part of this great experiment that we're all in. So today, this is a photograph right here. I got to visit this place just recently here. Well, recently, about a year ago. This is in Brussels. Brussels is the headquarters for NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, or OTAN if you speak French. And so this is the location. That's the city, in fact, where it's located on the outskirts of this city. And so this is the city that is a medieval city, essentially. And when we say that, it goes back to like the Renaissance, 13, 14, 1500s. And so this is a place where, in fact, human beings have thrived for a long, long period of time. This is in Belgium, by the way. And so Belgium is also the capital for the European Union. So the European Union is headquartered out of Brussels. And so this is, and with several other locations as well. But anyway, this is one of the places where, it gives me hope to think that, humanity's not on the rocks right now. So this is a beautiful place to visit. If you ever get a chance, go to Europe, go to Brussels if you can. So that brings us to a question. Okay, so we're talking about humans this time, right? So humans and humanity and hope. So what do humans do? What makes us, what defines us as humans? We care for our children. We care for the sick. We care for the elderly. And we provide medical care for one another. And so we've seen that actually, fossil evidence, in fact, for early hominids actually caring for one another, even the great apes. Okay, so the chimpanzees, in fact, it doesn't even have to be in the hominid group. In fact, there are animals that care for one another, and we know that they express feelings. In fact, Darwin even wrote a book about the expression of dogs and cats for and their tendency toward love and affection to folks around them. And so this is what we do as human beings. Not every human being has this capacity, sadly. But sympathy is one of these things, right, where we acknowledge the suffering of other people. And you've probably even seen videos of people who don't give a rat. I'm not going to use the word here, but they don't care anything about other human beings. And so, but sympathy is that sort of regard for other human beings and acknowledging that they are in suffering. Empathy, in fact, is a little step beyond that. In fact, and empathy is where you actually share those feelings, not just sympathy, but it goes beyond that. And it's like, because you can put yourself in their place. That's one of the things that we can do as human beings. That's why, this is just a science course, right? But there are all sorts of different things you can train yourself to be. And among those, you can learn how to act, right? And so actors develop empathy. And that's one of the practices that people do in acting. Even Neanderthals, the earliest human beings, would have had empathy, and that's one of the things that we've seen in the fossil record. And so they were even artists, right? And so artists, you can train monkeys and dogs and things like that to do art, but they don't know why they're doing it. But human beings knew why they were doing it. And that's kind of one of the great flowerings of humanity is cave art, from, up to 45,000 years ago all the way to the present. We still create art. And so art is one of these manifestations of being human. Neanderthals cared for the young. They cared for the old elderly. They provided health care. They found skulls in the Dordogne Valley in France that were Neanderthal, based on the characteristics of the skull. And you can see where there were great infections that actually disfigured the bone in the cheeks and things like that. And they found that it was somebody who didn't have any teeth even, and they were able to provide food for this person. And eventually, of course, everybody dies, even Neanderthals. And so we all have this sort of thing. And then the Native Americans, everybody has this capacity also to make medicines. So that's one of the things we've learned how to explore nature in the sense that we can maybe find a natural if not a cure, at least some sort of treatment for various things that afflict the human nature, humankind, as we do things. Okay, so there's a lot of myths out there, okay? In the 1950s, maybe even the 1940s, there was a cartoon called Alley-Oop, and Ula was his wife, and Denny was the dinosaur that he rode upon. It was all, fictional, of course, and it was just a chance for people to, I don't know, poke fun of the cavemen and everything, and finding out the cavemen actually were human beings too. I guess that was the whole point of being Alley-Oop. In fact, there were songs about it in the 1950s as well. You guys are probably most familiar with that story of Adam and Eve Gardner, who lived in a certain garden in the Near East, is where it's been proposed. Although some folks would have it actually in Missouri, okay? And so, I mean, that's not a bad thing to think about, because I always consider this earth to be part of my garden. And so I really don't like it when people mess up my garden, throwing their trash out and stuff like that. And so, be kind, be attentive, and be compassionate about the people around you, and know that other people are going through things that may make them behave in a bad way. And so doesn't mean you have to behave that way. And so this is Adam and Eve Gardner over here with the fig leaves and all that sort of thing. Fred and Wilma Flintstone down here at the bottom. You may have seen that with the Hanna-Barbera cartoons from Saturday mornings, and at least in the 1960s, that's what I got to watch. Anyway, so that was the Flintstones. Lived in Bedrock, all right? And best friends Barney and Betty Rubble, and Mr. Slate was the boss, right? And so all of these rock names that you may become familiar with if you take other geology courses. In fact, many of you, I encourage you to take, I think it's GLG 117, which is the course on the lab course, which makes this a lab science, essentially, and you'll be able to complete that. Anyway, if we were talking about fictional sort of characters in humanity, let's talk about another sort of fictional way that we address this. In fact, I wouldn't say fictional, it tries to be a reflection of what we understand at the time. And this is kind of the family tree for the hominids. In fact, we're going to start with the homininidae, which would include all of the subfamily that is part of the hominids, that would in fact include the great apes and folks like that. And if you didn't recognize it already, we're all great apes, okay? All humans are great apes, in fact. And so this shows you that we are related to monkeys, but we are not on the same branch of the tree, in fact. So our branches, we got to think about this as a tree. A tree has roots, and then it sends out a trunk. And then from that trunk, there are branches that go out. And if you get to the end of that branch, you're not going to be going back to that node where you actually could go up a different branch. And so we have gone off in one offshoot as human beings, separate from the rest of these. And so the old world baboons, the old world monkeys, they were in Africa. We're not really closely related to them. We are probably a little bit more closely related to the lemurs and things like that, things that wound up on like Madagascar, right? And so where they were on an island that could be protected. And so they were a type of primate, in fact. And so all of these primates, in fact, we don't have a real close relationship with today, but we know we have shared common ancestry. That's the catchphrase right there, shared common ancestry with the rest of the primates. And so the hominids would include things like, the gibbon. Okay, so the gibbon's out here as an outgroup, essentially, but it is something that would have been in the hominids. Okay, well, it's not in the hominids according to this thing, but it's pretty close. Okay, so it's one of the closer branches. Okay, from that stem group that we have. But the orangutans, the gorillas, the bonobos, and the chimpanzees, and the hobbit were all human beings. And so the hobbit, if you didn't know about it or read about it, is a extinct human hominid, hominin, part of this subfamily that would have been found in Indonesia in the island of Flores back, I think it was about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And they think that they are related probably more closely to Homo erectus than they are to Homo sapiens. But in fact, they were found as fossil evidence. So we don't have any hobbits today. But we have all of these other creatures. We have the chimpanzees. That's the genus Pan there, so Homininini. And then the gorillini is the gorilla, and of course the orangutan over here on the right-hand side, Pongo. And human beings, we have this shared common ancestor. It doesn't mean we're on the same exact branch. Okay, we have our own branch, and that branch started separating about 4 million years ago. So it's only been in the Pliocene and into the Pleistocene that human beings have really developed fully, in fact. Okay, so I was looking for like who would I put in as like the type representative for a human. So I decided I'm going to go with Travis Kelce here. So anyway, I could have put Taylor Swift in there too, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, they're both humans, right? And so that's what we have as humans. That's our branch of the tree. And I guess they would be maybe a little regarded as exceptional, I guess, because they do have celebrity status and really strong and, all of these sorts of aspects that we highly regard. In fact, even though we may not have the same stature or strength and everything like that these folks have had. Okay, so primates. Most of them had opposable thumbs. Some of them had a prehensile tail, but yet human beings lost that, of course. And so the prosimians, in fact, would include things like the lemurs and the simians, the more monkey-like sort of creatures. And so simians divided into old world monkeys and apes, okay? And so then in the new world, the hypothesis is, especially if you've been reading the book or listening to the book on Audible, you would have heard that it's like, well, we don't know how the New World monkeys got into North America. They probably didn't cross the Bering Land Bridge, and probably didn't follow the coastline because there was no coastline between Africa and South America at that time. But in fact, they probably crossed around 40 million years ago on a raft. Okay, so if you can imagine trees flooding out of something like the Congo River, something like that, the New World monkeys made their way to the New World before Native Americans, Native South Americans, or Native North Americans ever did. So hominids they're larger, of course. They have no tail. We're omnivores. We can eat both meat or vegetable. We have sexual dimorphism. Okay, so in general, the males tend to be larger, and that's what the dimorphism, two different sizes for the different sexes. And so we have living species, of course. That's the humans, the gorilla, the chimps, the bonobos, the orangutans, and so forth that you saw on the last slide here. The chimps can use tools. They can laugh. They can mourn. Okay, so when family members die, they actually express grief in the same sort of behaviors that we see in human beings as we observe human beings. Human beings can tell us, what it is, that loss, sense of loss. And it's said, anyway, I don't know if this is true or not, but it's said that young chimpanzees can actually outsmart a four-year-old child. And now it takes an enormous amount of energy and resources to raise children in the human family. And so I guess, so it's humans develop a little bit slower than what chimpanzees do. Although they have almost the same lifespan. I think chimpanzees can live to be quite old, like, in their 60s and 70s and so forth, I think. And they're mostly known, of course, from the wild, and the few that have been domesticated and made into companions. Okay, so anyway, this is the family tree that we think that we came from. And so here's the Homo sapiens at the very far right of this tree here. So the tree's not facing upward, it's facing to the right. And so it goes back 6 million years back here for this thing that is probably related, but notice they put a big question mark behind it. But if you go between 6 and 5 million years ago, that's the Ardipithecus, and so that's the Aramidus here. And so that goes from about 5.8 to about 4.3 million years ago. And then we find other fossils. And almost all these fossils, in fact, are found in Africa until you get to the very far right-hand side. And that's when things begin to show up in other places around the world. And so this was an early African evolution for all of these early hominids here. And so Australopithecines are the next group here. That's in the green here. And there are some that are offshoots of that we don't really know where or how they gave rise to other parts, and we don't know how they fit into the tree. That's Kenyanthropus platyops here up at the top of here. That's in the yellow there. And then there's the Paranthropus down here, which is an offshoot of the Australopithecines, maybe. Big question mark there as well. But these things, there's at least 3 species of those. So Boisei is one of them here, Robustus another one, and Ethiopicus is the third one here, and that's the oldest of the Paranthropus here. So the Australopithecines show up, and they are dashed in. You can see we don't know the exact relationship between these things, and there's question marks all over this diagram. But Homo habilis is one of the earliest hominids that would be regarded as part of the family tree that would have, not a direct lineage, but would have been shared common ancestry. So that's one of the earlier versions that we have fossil evidence for. Now, as I understand it, there's like probably about 400 or 450 fossils that help support this sort of understanding about where we came from. And that's where I'm going to take you on the journey here next. So if that's the early human phylogeny, it introduces you to some of these names. And so I'm going to go ahead and say them here. So Homo habilis, this is just in our family tree, Homo habilis. Homo rudolfensis, and that's from Lake Rudolph, which is in Africa. Homo ergaster. Homo erectus, that's one that actually may have made it out of Africa early on. And then Homo heidelbergensis, as the name suggests, that's actually in early Europe, in fact. So heidelbergensis is there. And then you see Neanderthals that show up, less than 300, well, about 400,000 years ago, okay? And Homo sapiens show up about 200,000 years ago. And so Homo erectus continued on for a long period of time there. And so these are all things that we consider to be human. In fact, everything that's within our family should be considered to be human, in fact, even though some lived in trees and some, were arboreal, I guess is what we call them, right? So, okay, so here we're going to start looking at the fossil evidence. This is Australopithecus afarensis. Afar Triangle is in Africa, in between Somalia and Ethiopia. It's where Djibouti is. It's where Eritrea is, in that area. So that's regarded as the Afar Triangle. It's one of the cradles of early civilization. Okay, so that is one of the places where they find these fossils. And so the skull had prominent brow ridges. It had a strong zygomatic arch. That's the cheek that you see on here. So they could actually have muscle attachments that would help crush whatever they're eating. And so they were bipedal, but partly arboreal. That's based on the shape of their feet. They don't actually show feet in this skeletal remains over here that are arranged very cleverly here. But you can see the jaw. You can see the various, the femur and the humerus and all things like that on there. And so Lucy is the one on the right over here. So that's the one that we have the most complete skeleton for these Australopithecines. So that's Australopithecus afarensis. It helps to market your discoveries. And so this is actually the work of Robert Johansen. I don't think his name was Robert. It could have been Richard Johansen. But anyway, he discovered this back in the 1970s, in fact. Our next stop along the way is Australopithecus africanus. This is from the Transvaal region of South Africa. And you notice on the lower left-hand side, that's a human skull for comparison right there. But in fact, they've got pieces of the skull, and they constructed as best they can here. It had still the brow ridges on it. It had a strong zygomatic arch still, like Australopithecus afarensis. It had a cranial lobe that was enlarged, so that means it probably had a larger brain case. The arm-leg ratio was more ape-like than afarensis. And so, once again, these things aren't necessarily a tree where you can say one's on lower branch and one's on the upper branch, but certainly you had different characteristics between these two species, different species of Australopithecines here. And so here's a Paranthropus. Remember, that's the ones that were at the bottom of the family tree in the sort of purple color that we had a couple slides ago here. They're from the Transvaal as well. And on this, you can actually see not only the strong brow ridge, but you also have this sort of like fin that's sticking out of the skull. We call that a sagittal crest. Okay, so the sagittal crest would have been so you could attach strong muscles to the jaws, and so you would have more crushing capacity in the jaws that way for these things. And so it's much more similar, in fact, to a gorilla is what they're trying to show you here, in fact. And so the gorilla is reconstructed down here on the lower left there. And so that's Paranthropus aethiopicus there. Our next stop along the way is that Robustus. Notice that the face is getting flatter on these things. It still has the strong brow ridges and the strong zygomatic arch. It has a large sagittal crest still, but not quite as large as the Aethiopicus there. But it is thought that these were the ones that were actually coming out of the trees at this time. Now, climate change probably had a huge impact on how things developed. And remember, we're talking about all of these things happening within, well, the last couple of million years. And so it puts them into a Pleistocene species, essentially. And so as Pleistocene species, climate was changing. There were huge lakes in North Africa at this time. And there would have been human beings pretty much populating much of the continent. And as the trees began to recede into what we know today as the rainforest, there were savannas that developed. And so these things would have come out of the trees and been the biped-dwelling savanna hominids, if you will. So here's Robustus, yet again here. This is from the Transvaal. So the one previous to this was 1.2 to 2.3 million years. This one's from 1.2 to 2 million years. Remember, I've kind of reversed the ages on this, so the shorter distance to when these things were found. So the youngest one we found is like 1.2 million years old, and so that's still within the Pleistocene here. Still with the protruding eyebrow. Everything that described the last Robustus is still the same now. So here's that family tree once again here. And so it's just another take on it. This is from the World Encyclopedia, I think it's called here. And so they show the Australopithecines in the red color down here, and then that Rudolfensis and the Kenya Anthropus down here on the left-hand side in the purple. But here's the hominids all the way up through here. So Homo habilis is the first one that's going to show up for us. Homo ergaster next then, and then the antecessor is going to show up along with Erectus at about 1 million years ago. Well, Homo erectus actually shows up at 1.8 there, as you see it. And so, yeah, just another look at the family tree here. Here's one of them that was found not too long ago. This was in 2013. This is Homo nadali, and it's we don't know if it went back to 3 million years, but that's the maximum age it could be. When you get into cave sediments, it's very difficult to date cave sediments. And so they know that it goes back millions of years, but they're not quite sure how far. And it was found in a cave. It was found in Rising Star Cave. I got a little map up here on the right-hand side that shows you where Rising Star Cave, and that's in an area of South Africa called the Transvaal. And so they use stone tools. There are stone tools associated with burials. And so they not only buried the dead, they had a structural similarity to the Australopithecines, but they also had modern hands. Okay, so slightly different from what the previous tree-dwelling sort of hominids would have had. And the skull very closely resembles what we have today as Homo sapiens and some other Homo species anyway. So anyway, that is Homo nadali. Here's the cave where they found it here. This is a cross-section or a diagram that shows you that there were different units that they've excavated there, and they found bones littering this entire cave. And so some of them are pretty well preserved because they're coated with cave sediments and actually cave incrustations and things like that, which preserve some of the materials of these creatures. And so they're part of the family tree here. So this is Dynodali chamber here where they found many of these. And so you can see on here the bones they depict here in the bottom cave sediments in that cave. Okay, so next we're going to go on. Here's some of these early hominids then. Homo habilis up here. Human hands, right? Human skull for the most part. Notice the brow ridges are a little bit less prominent than what they were on the Australopithecines. And then the next one is Homo erectus. And Homo erectus actually made it out of Africa. They're pretty sure. They find Homo erectus all the way to Indonesia. And so in Indonesia, they think that Homo erectus may have displaced the what they call the Homo florensis, which would have been the hobbits. Okay, so hobbits were very diminutive in size. They were quite cave-dwelling hominids, but they probably predated the arrival of Homo erectus, and so they actually made it out of Africa as well. So that's a big hypothesis in anthropology, as they call it, the out of Africa hypothesis. Obviously, not every hominid made it out of Africa. Native Africans today are still there, and in fact, some even made it out of Africa and then returned to Africa, according to DNA. And so I share DNA with African populations because of that, because of the R haplogroup, the R1 haplogroup that I belong to. And so I have relatives, from a DNA standpoint, who live in the central part in the Tbilisi, I think it's Tbilisi Mountains. It's not Tbilisi, I forget the name of the mountains, but they're in the middle of the Sahara Desert, in fact. And then there's also folks I share DNA with on the west of Africa, on the west coast of Africa as well. That's the R1b complex. It's a haplogroup in DNA. So this is Homo erectus and Homo florensis. Floresiensis, and then Homo nadali over here on the right-hand side. And so you can see that the feet are a little bit different on Homo nadali there. And so these are all hominids. They're all family members, if you want to call it that. They all would have been relatively intelligent, and they were capable of great things, I guess is what I would say. Here's Homo habilis here as well. Homo habilis 2.5 to 1.9 million years ago. Remember, MA stands for million annum, or million years ago. This is from the Olduvai Gorge. It's in Tanzania in Africa. Has low brow ridges. Now, the Olduvai Gorge is famous for the hominid fossils that are preserved there, but also the trackways that were left behind by humans there. They find them in volcanic ash, and so while some of the volcanoes were erupting in the East Africa Rift Zone, these things would actually walk across that soft mud, essentially, that had formed from that volcanic ash. So they left tracks behind. And so we know that they were walking at that time and weren't just up in the trees. So this would have been Homo habilis right here. The brow ridges are a little bit lower than what they were in some of the other early hominids. They have smaller teeth, maybe not crushing bones like some of the early hominids were. They have a greater cranial capacity. And then they also, either Australopithecines or the Paranthropus creatures that were around back then. Homo rudolfensis, and they may have coexisted, right? You notice that many of these ages actually overlap with one another. They would have known each other on the savannah, let me put it that way. And you better stay out of their cave, because they'll mess with, if you mess with the cave, you're messing with us, sort of thing. And so tribalism goes a long way back. And so Homo rudolfensis down here at the bottom, very similar to Homo habilis down here. Okay, next on the list here, from what we understand about modern human beings and the ancient human beings, is the structure of the joints became a lighter species, I guess, than the Australopithecines, and then we lost hair, and we developed sweat glands essentially to dissipate heat, because we could use evaporative cooling then. So as we lost that sort of like furry covering, most of it anyway. I've still got my hair, but some people go bald, right? Of course, and so and we get graybacks even in the human Homo sapiens. We still have graybacks, but here you can see these people running, right? So they're running for fun there, right, or for recreation, or for exercise, right? So it's just it's a habit, it's a hobby, if you will. And over here on the right-hand side, that's an old photograph right here, but it's showing what human beings are really designed to do. We're designed to be long-distance runners. In fact, that's one of my favorite reggae tunes, is Long Distance Runner, from Bob Marley, I think it was, but I'm not sure. But anyway, here you can see people running from long distances this way. And it's thought that was actually an adaptation to be able to run down animals that they would have been able to spear, but you'd have to track it then, right? Because if you don't get to the meat before the lion does, you're going to go starve. Okay, so you have to track down the game that you're hunting. And this was a time when early human beings, they were all hunter-gatherers. And so you had to gather the fruit from the trees or the nuts from the trees, or you had to hunt down the gazelles or whatever that you were hunting in the savanna landscapes that were across Africa at that time. So next we go on to some more fossil remains. This is Homo ergaster here. And again, this is found, this one's actually found in Europe and Asia as well. I'd forgotten that. So Homo ergaster here is once thought to be Homo erectus, but in fact they have some advanced stone tool technologies that they had developed at that time. Next we're going to go on to Homo erectus, and these guys for sure were out of Africa here, in Africa and Asia. And so they still had very prominent brow ridges, these guys. And remember, just because one of the ancestors before this, or we can't call them ancestors, we have shared common ancestry probably, I guess is what you'd say. So in fact, the early ancestors of Homo sapiens would in fact have been a different offshoot of the tree from these Homo erectus here. But very prominent brow ridges on this guy. The skull has a sulcus between the brow and the forehead there. That's the sort of divot that runs across the front there of the skull. And from 230,000 years ago to 500,000 years ago, they find these sorts of skulls in places like China. And so, there have been multiple generations of migrations. I'm not saying the Chinese people evolved from this species, okay? So that's different, okay? Homo sapiens came out of Africa towards the end, in fact. And so there's a very huge, complex sort of group that came out of Africa. And that would have been modern Chinese folks today. So Homo heidelbergensis, okay, so this is mostly from Europe and Africa here. They found it in Germany. It's from Zimbabwe as well. It resembles this Homo rhodesiensis. So you're not getting the full picture here, but rhodesiensis here. And so that is what they think that Homo heidelbergensis was closely related to. Sloping forehead on this and a low sagittal rise. Low, it doesn't have the muscle attachment that some of the earlier species would have had. So finally we get to the Homo neanderthalensis here, and so that's only from as late as 30,000 years ago. They were still living in Europe, okay, and 200,000 years ago they had come out of Africa and probably were cave-dwelling sort of creatures that lived in Europe and Western Asia. And so when we're talking about Western Asia, we're talking about the Middle East areas. And so many of so in other words, you don't find Homo neanderthalensis in Africa. So that's where Homo sapiens were developing at that time. And so the Neanderthals were an early leaving after the Homo erectus had already come out and the Homo ergaster had already come out of Africa. And so down here, so you see the Neanderthalensis as in comparison to Homo habilis down here. Heavy jaws, large prominent brow ridge on them, sloping forehead. They call that prognathism. Okay, so compare that to the subnasal capacity for the, so you can see, in other words, there was a sort of flattened face for Homo habilis down here, as opposed to having more of a nasal sort of like protrusion. And so the occipital protrusion of the skull, in fact, that's towards the back of the skull there, and then the rounded nasal openings. And so these things would have been more well adapted to Ice Age climates in which they existed 30,000 years ago. And remember, we were still in the Ice Age, right? That was still after the MIS-5E, but they lived through the MIS-5E, is what I'd say, in Asia and Africa, and Europe. And so these are early Europeans, in fact, here. And so here's a Homo neanderthalensis from Iraq, right here, a skull that was found in a cave. I'm going through these kind of fast, but they find a lot of these in the Dordogne Valley, which was in the south of France. In fact, here is the Homo neanderthalensis from about 45,000 years ago here. It was discovered all the way back in 1909 here. And so you can see that many of these early Neanderthals were actually cave discoveries. People were curious about science, in the early 1900s. And so from France here, this is the Dordogne Valley here. 1909, 1908 for the skull at the bottom down here, late Pleistocene, of course, and so that one, we don't know exactly what age, how many hundreds of thousands of years ago that was, and probably not much more than 50,000 years, because they lasted all the way till 30,000 years ago, both in the Middle East and in Europe. So Homo sapiens, probably the easiest, I like to round it off to about 200,000 years, but I've seen it elsewhere listed. I think this comes from National Geographic as being around 130,000 years. Things that you would definitely identify based on the skeletal remains and so forth. About 130,000 years ago, we have lighter bones. In fact, and it's considered to be gracile compared to the Neanderthal. And so we are very closely related to Neanderthals, and in fact, many of us actually carry. I don't know if I do or not, but certainly many modern human beings actually have up to like 2.5% Neanderthal genes in them, but usually it's somewhere between 1 and 4% Neanderthal genes that are in the modern human beings. There have been a lot of speculation about why there's not a larger contribution of Neanderthal genes, because they certainly interbred. And we know that for a fact. Okay, you don't get genetic material from another species unless you actually bred with them. But the skull has a higher forehead. The face is flatter, less sloping. The skull lacks the prominent brow ridges that Neanderthals had. The cranial capacity was actually slightly smaller than what a Neanderthal would have had. And so the Neanderthal actually has a larger cranial capacity. But there's been books written about this. In fact, I think I've mentioned Stephen Jay Gould in here before. Stephen Jay Gould was at Harvard, and he was the curator. Well, he's the head curator for the Museum of Comparative Zoology, the Museum of Comparative Zoology. So Stephen Jay Gould makes the argument in his book, Mismeasure of Man. It's not really the cranial capacity that decides how smart you are. In fact, it's the corpus callosum, which is a structure inside the brain, that decides how much capacity you have, how connected are the two lobes of your brain with one another. And so the corpus callosum is very important, in fact. Also, the Mismeasure of Man also disputes and challenges many of the early 1900s conceptions about, people used to feel the skulls of other people. It was called phrenology. And so as you would feel the skull of certain people, you would say, oh, well, you're going to have a capacity. It's like palm reading practically, right? Palm reading is a myth, okay? Reading the bumps on a skull is a myth, okay? Unless you've been concussed too many times. In that case, you're probably going to lose some brain cells from that damage that you had as from traumatic brain injuries. But in fact, the Mismeasure of Man says phrenology doesn't work. It's not there. So the earliest fossil species came out of Africa, obviously. And then Neanderthals show up in places like the Middle East. They show up in Europe. And as it turns out, actually, the highest proportion of DNA that can be assigned to the Neanderthals is actually showing up in places like in the Far East, in fact. And so they have up to, some people have up to 2.5%, I think, there. But it doesn't mean that they have the same skeletal sort of contributions, because these are all human beings, right? These are all Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens, let me put it that way. And in fact, even my group, okay, so the derivative part that I am, about 60,000 years ago, in my family tree, there was a couple of evolutionary novelties. In my mother's side, there was this evolutionary novelty that made us so that we were possible to generate energy a little bit slightly. We have a slightly higher body temperature than what most human beings have, most Homo sapiens. And then my dad's side, that was the early R1B1, as I mentioned, sort of like capacity. And so they spread across Europe early on, and they would have met the Neanderthals and interacted with Neanderthals. And so some people think that Neanderthals were like essentially driven out essentially by modern man because, I don't know, just too aggressive or something. I don't know, but the early folks that moved in, and then later there were like farmers and so forth that came in to Europe at that time. about 60,000 years ago. So that is the idea, this out of Africa sort of hypothesis. And so one of the interesting things I've had the opportunity to do when I was an undergraduate at Missouri State University, I had the opportunity to be the draftsman for the Center for Archaeological Research. And being the draftsman, I got to talk with the guys who were trained in both archaeology and anthropology. And it was pointed out to me at one point, there's really no such thing. And actually, he's just recently retired, or Jack Ray is his name. And so he said there's really no such thing as race. If you took the current genome for the human population and said, we're going to take a small group of you and transport you to some island and leave you there for millions of years, you will wind up with black pigmentation. You will wind up with the entire rainbow in the human spectrum over a couple million years. And so we would be able to regenerate the human race if we were isolated in some way. So the thing that we need to do, in fact, is to make sure that we don't face a crisis like that. So we actually face the challenges that come towards us. And so, so race is a purely mythical sort of, well, it's not mythical, but it's certainly something that, we share common DNA. Let me put it that way. 99.8% of our DNA is just about the same. And there's this wide spectrum of DNA, and DNA, of course, is going to continuously evolve. And so with the Y DNA, that comes from your father and his father before that, and it goes back thousands and thousands of years. And so there's been, over the last 50,000 years in Europe anyway, if you have European ancestry, it has evolved substantially since that last 50,000 years. And then there have been developments in the mtDNA, that's the mitochondrial DNA. You get that from your mother. And so if you're a man, you can have both varieties tested genetically to be able to tell what your sexually, what do they call them, sexually derived DNA versions. Anyway, it's these two, the Y DNA and the mtDNA. And so that's mitochondrial DNA. So you get your mitochondrial DNA from your mother, and she gets it from her mother, and she gets it from her mother, and that goes all the way back. And so the mtDNA, until you wind up with some evolutionary novelty of some sort. And so, as I was saying, for my mtDNA, it goes back 60,000 years to the Middle East, essentially. So other folks that arrived, and so even today, there are isolated populations. And so Africa, it's fairly robust. I think Africa has the largest DNA diversity of the entire world. And so if you just took Africans and put them on an island for 2 million years, you would develop all the variations that we have today in all of humanity. So in fact, it's a very robust population in Africa. Very, I guess I would say survivable, I guess is what I'd say. So some of the earliest modern human beings came out of Africa into the Middle East. They wound up in the Caucasus Mountains region and maybe in the Steppes region, a little bit north of the Caucasus Mountains, and that's where the name Caucasian comes from. And so Caucasus Mountains, they migrated west. And so many of the oldest groups, and I think the Welsh come out of this, and that's my surname is Welsh, from Basque lineages. And so they're very similarly related. They're not the same part of the tree, but in fact the Welsh actually have shared common ancestry with the Basque and also some of what they call the dark, what do they call it? It's the Black Irish or the Black Welsh. And so I have some of that sort of capacity in myself. In fact, that what it means is that we're darker complected than what most lighter complected Welsh or Irish would have. And so they were later comers to the island and to Wales, in fact, for that matter. But the Basque still retain that sort of dark pigmentation as well, as I do. So that is the Basque region is in between France and Spain. And it's in the Pyrenees Mountains, and they've been isolated there for many, many, I'd say probably tens of thousands of years. And people think that it's not just geographic isolation. The language actually served as a barrier, and so they married within their same language group, or at least paired up in their same language group, and that gave them that sort of genetic capacity to be separate from other groups around them that moved in later. So Today we have all sorts of this sort of DNA that has migrated across the globe. So here's the map for many of these early populations, right? And on here you can actually see that there were folks that migrated back into Africa at that time. And so in West Africa, that's my group that came in there 60,000 years ago into West Africa, carrying with them the R1B1. And so there's all of these sort of migrations, not only out of Africa, but also the early migration in other places, right? So remember that Homo erectus probably came into the Indonesian region, displacing the Floresienses, and then the modern human beings came into that area as well, and then displaced many of those Homo erectus folks that were there as well. It's one of the earliest populations that has isolation anywhere on the globe is about 40,000, 60,000 years ago, and that's the native Aboriginal Australians that live in Australia, obviously. And so those were the folks that lived in the outback in other parts of Australia. And Europeans didn't arrive there until the early 1800s, in fact. Yeah, well, they sailed past, but they never really landed much, okay? And so the first colonization from Europeans on Australia would have been just in the last couple of hundred years here now. Same sort of story actually happens in places like Polynesia. The Polynesians spread from places like Tahiti into Hawaii. And so from Tahiti, they went to places like Tonga, or they went to New Zealand, where they became the Maori peoples. And so the Maori peoples arrived about 1,000 years ago in New Zealand. And it's only been in the last couple hundred years that folks had came from Europe to settle in New Zealand as well. And so there's some proud cultures all around the world, a proud history. I'd say find out more about yourself with a DNA test. Okay, so I've told you about two kinds of DNA that you can test. That's the Y-DNA if you're a man. If you're a woman, you can test for mtDNA. And if you're a man, you can also test for mtDNA. Well, what was your mother's mitochondrial DNA? And then you can also do something called autosomal DNA. And I have not done that yet, but I plan on doing it pretty soon here. So autosomal DNA is the DNA of the rest of you. And it doesn't tell you the deep heritage that you would get from the Y-DNA or the mtDNA, which goes back tens of thousands of years. But this is going to tell you more about, like, okay, did your European ancestors come from Bulgaria, or did they come from Denmark, or did they come from Lapland in Finland? So that's going to tell you more about the more recent sort of migrations of your family tree. And I got to tell you, you may think you're 100% of some nationality, everybody's mixed. Everybody is mixed. If you go back 10 generations, everybody's mixed, okay? So in fact, we're going to go on with the rest of the skeletal evidence next, okay? So human beings next. And so these are products of that sort of early mixing, okay? And so here's the, from 90,000 years ago, from a cave. Okay, so in a cave, they found Homo sapien skull, discovered in 1932. That's a modern human being right there. Here's another modern human being, this one found in France right here. So they were, and this was an interesting one, because this is the one that has the capacity to have the care of other human beings. And so the R1B DNA comes directly out of Cro-Magnon. It's just one tiny mutation away from Cro-Magnon. And so this is a Cro-Magnon skull right here that actually had an infection, a bone infection, in fact, but so people cared for him. It was discovered in 1868 here in a cave in the south of France. And there's a lot of caves in the Dordogne Valley because it's a limestone setting. So the Cro-Magnon, this is a family group, and they found infants, they found males, and people cared for one another there. Okay, this is from Indonesia. Modern human being here. Homo sapien. Found in a rock shelter. Human beings have that capacity. Okay, think about this for a minute, right? You're a human being, right? Where do you live? You live in an apartment building, right? I live in a house. I can afford a house. I pay a mortgage. I'm buying this place. It is a cave. I bought a cave. You're living in an apartment. You're living in a cave. You're living in like a 5-chamber cave, right? Place to cook your meals, place to go to the bathroom and have it sanitarily disposed of. And you have a place to sleep and a place to entertain other human beings. And so you live in a cave. And in fact, in your cave, you actually have artwork. So here's some artwork, in fact, for these people who lived in caves. And so we live in caves. It's the same thing. We are a Pleistocene species, human beings. Homo sapiens are a Pleistocene species. So we have artwork like this. So here's a horse, and you can see the oryx down there on the bottom down there. Those are painted by human beings here. This is from Altamira in Spain, and Lascaux, the one at the top up here. So that is another. People have disputed: is it actually a Neanderthal painting, or is it? They're human beings too, okay? So it doesn't matter what your species is because we shared ancestry with Neanderthals, we're all human beings. And so this is the cave that's in Spain, Altamira, and then the cave that is in France here in Lascaux region, close to the Dordogne, and it's in the Dordogne Valley. Here's the cave that the Homo florensis, Floresensia lived in Indonesia. And this is where they found those early hominids there. We're cave-dwelling species. Okay, so here's part of that controversy. Did Florensis come out of Erectus, or was it a offshoot of Homo sapiens that just happened to live in that cave? And so, but anyway, that is the idea, okay, of how we have these various trees. And so these are artificial concepts. I guess that's what I'm trying to get to you as well. And so there is some, there's a potential for crossing of some of these things into different parts of the tree. So you can actually graft on some species, I guess is what I would say. Okay, in the next slide, I'm gonna start getting philosophical on you here. So if modern human beings have somewhere between 1.5 and 2.1% Neanderthal sort of genetics, we know that we today, just based on the bones of Neanderthals that have been partially preserved, we have about 20% of their genome. We know that it exists, and we've actually been able to sequence that genome. And these are like wax beings that they put together up here at the top. That's not a photograph of a couple that is alive today, but it's based on the bone structure and everything. They said this is what if you put flesh back on these bones and the musculature that seems to go with the cranial capacity and along with the bone structure, that's what these human beings would look like. Those are Neanderthal reconstructions up here at the top. And you may well know people that look like that, but at the same time, it's like, they're human beings, right? And they can be really smart, or they can be whatever they are. They're human beings. It doesn't matter what they're like, right? Down here at the bottom, you can see some more folks. And so these are actually regarded as Denisovan. Denisovans are a more recent offshoot, about 50,000 years ago. Came out of Africa, but they got mixed in with the genes, and so Denisovan genes show up in East Asian populations more so than the European ones. They don't show up in the European ones very commonly. But anyway, those are Denisovans down here at the bottom, and a reconstruction based on their skeletal features, and it's based on very limited. So it's only found in one cave in Denisova, I guess it is, in southern Russia. In fact, from the Altai Mountains, I think it is, in that area. So if we have Neanderthals, if we have Denisovans, we also have modern human beings. That's what you see down here on the bottom right. And so those are human beings with modern firearms, I would say here, opposed to people getting too close to their property, I think. And it's actually a photo out of St. Louis there. Sorry. But anyway, I'm not going to make any political statement here. At least not yet anyway. But anyway, what makes us human? Remember that list that I had early on? Empathy. The ability to care for the old, the young, the medical care. The ability to empathize. The ability to understand other people. And so not all human beings have that capacity, sadly. So anyway, that is kind of a snapshot of the human family tree here. Now let me tell you about Homo sapiens in a little bit more detail. Homo sapiens have some bad characteristics as well. So what makes us humans are the kind things. we also have a capacity for incredible amounts of violence as well. And so human beings are capable of war. Well, we also know that chimpanzees and baboons are capable of war as well. They can actually have tribes that go after one another. But those tribes are like located in a savanna, or they're in a jungle or something like that, right? And so not huge, large-scale conflagrations, essentially. Conflagration is actually an adoption of a term for fires that get out of control. And so we've already had 2 world wars in our recent memory of human beings. And I fortunately missed both of those. But there's wars going on all the time. And there are wars going on right now, which I'm not very happy about, because everybody's a human being. Okay, I think war is the greatest waste of resources that can ever happen on this planet. And I almost cursed there. We are capable of genocide. People who don't look like us, we want to destroy them sometimes. Not everybody does. It's better to develop kindness and capacity. That's the most human of all capacities, okay? So genocide, we've been, forced by politics sometimes, right? And so the ruler of the Soviet Union was Stalin, right? That's claimed that he killed about 30 million people in his rule of terror. And mostly Ukrainians, as it turns out. He starved Ukrainians to death back in the 1930s. And so Ukrainians did not like the Russians at that time. I still think they don't. And so there are wars going on right now that should not be going on. And so since humanity, we've been able to do things like gendercide. People in certain areas will kill the males and then take the females, and then put them into the stable of the harem or whatever, And so I don't mean to choose any particular word for that, in fact, but Genghis Khan, they claim that most Europeans have some sort of descendancy from Genghis Khan, who conquered much of the steppes in eastern parts of Asia, in fact, and the eastern parts of Europe. And so, so that's not a good capacity. And just a few years ago, there was a policy in China that said you get to have one child. And so many of the female children were either adopted to folks in other places in the world, or they were left to die. And some people just said, screw you, I'm going to have my other second child regardless of whether it's a female or a male. And so they did that. And so from the 1500s to the 1900s, remember that there's an old saying that we used to have in our grade school. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? And so Europeans came to the New World and brought with them many of the diseases that killed off many of the Native Americans. And so Native Americans were not only killed by disease, they were also killed by outright aggression. And so there was this genocidal war against Native Americans, whether you were South American. It wasn't quite so bad in South America, but it was pretty bad. And it went across North America as well. It went all across the Caribbean. So the original Taino were I think the highest Taino population is still in places like Hispaniola or in places like Puerto Rico. So there's still some Taino heritage there, but not direct heritage. It was the European colonization effort was very successful in destroying all the native cultures that were around back then. So it's estimated there's about 8 million people were killed from Europeans coming to the New World. In the 1900s, this goes back to Belgium, the very first slide here. It was King Leopold of Belgium, who, like many of the other European powers, wanted to secure land in Africa and colonize it. And so the colonial effort also extended to like the Italians. The Italians conquered Ethiopia and displaced the king there, who was Haile Selassie. And so, it's horrible the things that Europeans did in Africa. It's horrible what they did in other places, but in the Congo in particular, King Leopold of Belgium came in, and he is estimated to have killed about 8.5 million people. In the 1900s, in China, we're up to 800,000 people killed in China in the 1900s by Europeans in part. In the Boxer Rebellion, Europeans tried to colonize China, and the Chinese weren't going to have any part of it. And so they, although the Europeans made off with certain parts of it, like Macau and Hong Kong and places like that, in parts of Manchuria, they were able to successfully take pieces of it, but the Chinese threw them out. In 1912 to 1812, there were about 15 million people. 1912 to 1918, there were about 15 million people killed in World War I. From 1915, in the middle of World War I, in Russia, there were about 9 million Russians that were killed. And that's when the Russians had the Russian Revolution and communism overthrew the monarchy there. And there were about 9 million people that were considered to be, I think they were called White Russians, Belarusians at that time. But anyway, there was another, almost like an ethnic cleansing, okay, but they wanted everybody to become their political brand at that time. In the 1920s, there was another genocide that killed about 1.5 million Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks who lived in the Caucasus Mountains. That was perpetrated by the Turkish people in Turkey, modern Turkey, an Ottoman Empire at that time. And so that was, the Ottoman Empire was part of the Axis during the World War I. So about 1.5 million people were killed there. I've known people who are Armenian, and they really don't care for what happened to them back in that sort of genocide that occurred in the 1920s, and they don't forget. That's only 100 years ago. From the 1920s to the 1930s, as I mentioned previously, I said 30 million people. Other people claim it's 20 million, but here from the 20s to the 30s, that was Stalin's Soviet Union, his ethnic cleansing essentially of anybody who didn't hold the same views. Or, if somebody told on you and said, he's not being a good communist or whatever, they would kill you or put you in a work camp. And that would normally kill you if you got put in a work camp. So in the 1930s, the Communist Revolution began with Chairman Mao. And he went through much of China. And roughly at the very end of this, in 1939, that's when the Japanese invaded China. And in 1939 to 1945, there were about 45 million people that were killed in World War II. Do not want World War III. Do not ask for it. And so there was the Jewish Holocaust that killed 6 million people. In the Japanese, they call it the Rape of Nanking or the Rape of Nanjing. There were 200,000 people killed in one city. And it was horrific, that sort of catastrophe that happened. And so the Chinese people have no love lost for the Japanese people, I can tell you. The Americans experienced a huge loss and I had a personal loss actually at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked the American fleets that were anchored at Pearl Harbor. Fortunately, our 4 aircraft carriers were away at the time on maneuvers. My uncle was on the USS Arizona. He was killed in that attack by a Mitsubishi bomber that came in and dropped a torpedo or dropped a bomb on the smokestacks, and it went into the magazine of that battleship, and that battleship blew up in place and broke in half essentially, and then wound up on the bottom of Pearl Harbor next to Ford Island. In that attack, there were about 2,000 people. Now, 1,100 alone were killed on the USS Arizona, and about 2,500 people were killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, why did the Japanese attack, you might ask? Well, I would ask you to go to Wikipedia and learn what is probably what most people regard as the truth about that. And the Americans more or less cut off the oil supply. We had an oil embargo, and we weren't going to deliver oil to Japan because of what they've been doing in China. And so in China, we knew what the catastrophe was. And in fact, if you go into history, American pilots were actually flying in to help the Chinese. And they were called the Flying Tigers, in fact. That was a group of people flying P-40s from Burma into China on bombing runs and things like that to repel the Japanese attack on the Chinese. And so the Japanese didn't want us doing that. They wanted our oil. And so we also wanted to keep Japan from taking the oil from Indonesia, which had large stocks of oil at that time as well, and the Philippines as well. And so the Japanese not only attacked Pearl Harbor, but they also attacked the Philippines and American bases there. They tried to get into Australia, but they were repelled at the Battle of Coral Sea. And so they came into what today is Myanmar. It was Burma at that time, known as Burma at that time. They came into Thailand. They came into the Vietnam. They came into most places in China and took those places. And so very slowly the Americans pushed through an effort of island hopping. We pushed the Japanese back from island to island until finally, at the very close of that war, on August of 1945, the North Americans, the United States Army, Air Corps, dropped 2 nuclear bombs. It's the only time that nuclear bombs have been used in a war, and let's hope it's the only time it ever happens. There were over 100,000 people killed from those nuclear explosions that leveled Hiroshima first, and 3 days later leveled Nagasaki, and it took those 2 places and incinerated them entirely. And in Hiroshima, it was the base for one of their fleets. It was an area that where there was a lot of industrial complexes as well. Nagasaki as well. They had industrial complexes that were helping supply the Japanese Army and Navy with their munitions. And so the Americans came in, and it was President Harry S. Truman who bombed and made that happen and ordered the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You would think that people would learn, right? And so today there's a nuclear club that includes the United States, China, Russia, North Korea now. It also includes places like Great Britain. It includes Australia by de facto, right? France has their own nuclear programs. And as it turns out, even Israel has their own nuclear program. And so all of these places that are in the nuclear club don't want anybody else to join, because we know how bad it can be when dialogue breaks down and war breaks out. And it's a failure. It's a failure to have war. It's a failure of rational reasoning. It's a failure of dialogue to resolve issues. And so in human beings, if we don't have an issue right now, we'll develop one. And that's the sad tragedy about human beings. And I will point, in fact, to the last election in the United, well, 2 elections ago, there was something called QAnon. If you're a QAnon believer, you probably ought to rethink your rational reasoning. It's like people are more willing to believe lies than they are to believe the truth when it's presented to them. Then you might say, whose truth? Well, okay, the truth that has been weighed by many, many people over decades, and trying to understand what's happened on this planet. That's not enough. And so there were roughly 220,000 people that were killed by the nuclear bombs. In 1947, after World War II was over, people in the Indian subcontinent had 2 different religions. They had Hinduism predominantly, and Sikhism, Jainism. There's a whole bunch of different religions that exist in that vicinity. But there was also Islam. And so Islam and Hinduism could not coexist, apparently. And so when the Europeans, the Brits, the Great Britain, okay, so this is the UK, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, decided they were going to leave their colony of India. And they said, well, you guys who are Hindu are going to go up to the southern part of the peninsula here, and we're going to give the land that's in the northeast and the northwest to the Muslim folks. And it became Pakistan. It today is known as Pakistan. It was called West Pakistan at the time. The country Bangladesh was known as East Pakistan. They separated from West Pakistan in the 1970s. And so those are the Muslim countries that still exist in the peninsula, the subcontinent of India today. Hindus resided in the south, but when that happened, all hell broke loose, and Hindu were fighting Muslim and so forth. And today there's a long animosity between, more so between Pakistan and India than there is from Bangladesh and India, I think. I think that the Bangladeshis are pretty, they're okay. So anyway, in 1947, they call it partition. It was the partitioning of the Indian subcontinent there. 500,000 people were killed. In the 1950s, in the Korean War, there were about 2.5 million people, mostly Koreans, that were killed in that war, and also a lot of Chinese. When the North Koreans were pressed hard, the North Koreans advanced all the way down to the very southern tip to Pusan in the south of the Korean Peninsula, and then the Americans landed in force and pushed the Koreans all the way back almost to halfway into North Korea today. And then the Chinese said, well, that's enough of that. And the Chinese came in to assist their allies in North Korea and pushed the Americans back to this line that today became a demilitarized zone. So when they've never ceased hostilities, and so a state of war still exists between North Korea and South Korea. South Korea was more democratic leaning, and North Korea has a strongman, Kim Jong-un, who runs the country, and likely his sister will run it after he passes at some point here. Anyway, there's a sad, long history, and today they both have nuclear weapons on their sides, the South Koreans by affiliation with the Americans. And so there's this threat of, they call it mutually assured destruction when you have nuclear weapons. Now, I've been going for a long time here. In fact, we're almost done here, and so I'm sorry to rail on this, but I hate war. If it doesn't kill people, and it's killed people in my family, and I'm probably sure that it may have killed people in your families as well. In the 1975, the people who lived in the country of Cambodia came into the center of Cambodia, the capital of Cambodia, and decided that everybody there was bad, and they called them the Khmer Rouge. They were communists, and so that's the Americans began bombing in Cambodia, and many people died there. In fact, there's a movie called The Killing Fields that was made about this sort of episode here, and so the name escapes me right now. Let me look it up actually, because this is important. It's Phnom Penh. That's what I'm trying to think of. Phnom Penh is the capital of Cambodia. They came into Cambodia and put many of the folks there into work camps, or then they put them directly into prisons. If your neighbor ratted on you, it's like, oh, he's he's not part of the Khmer movement, right? And so if he's not communist, or if you wore glasses, they would kill you. And so that happened in 1975. In the 1990s, in South Africa, along one of the lakes there, in Rwanda and Burundi, they've had massacres there as well. And that was between the Hutu and the Tutsi tribes. The thing is, they weren't really tribes. They were actually designations placed on them by the occupational peoples who were from Great Britain. And so the oppressors in that sort of region said, hey, you're tall and lanky, we're going to call you Tutsi. Hey, you're short and, shorter stature or whatever, maybe a little heavier set, we're going to call you Hutu. And so they took those two groups, and those two groups formed an identity about this artificial designation that was given to them. And today, Hutus marry Tutsis and things like that. And so it's just an arbitrary designation. And so across the countryside, the Hutu rose up with machetes and killed a lot of people. There's a movie done with this called Hotel Rwanda, or Hotel Burundi. I think it's Hotel Rwanda. And so you can watch that and learn a little bit of history, even from popular culture. So when war happens, that's the end of rational thinking and dialogue. That's when dialogue stops. I hate war. Last slide of this entire lecture series. And I know I've been on a soapbox here for a little bit, okay? I really, there's some things that really frustrate me as a professor, that people don't use rational thinking for some things, but some you do for other things. Here's the real great accomplishments that human beings are capable of. 5,000 years ago, we built pyramids. It was not aliens. Okay, that was human beings that made that. We had engineering 5,000 years ago. We still have engineering today. And so we construct things. And so the constructions that last that length of time, that's phenomenal. And so, ancient aliens, that's all conspiracy bullshit, okay? In the 10th century, the early Chinese cultures developed vaccinations. They actually had people inhale nasally some of the, weakened virus, essentially. So vaccinations have saved literally billions of lives on this planet. Things like yellow fever, things like malaria, things like smallpox is the greatest one ever. And so we have measles vaccinations, right? And today, because we have numbskulls in certain levels of political government who do not believe in vaccinations, they should be ousted and held responsible for the atrocities they're committing before our very eyes. And so there are billions of lives that have been saved by vaccinations. Human beings have been able to do other good things, right? In 1783, there were people who went up in balloons for the first time. We were in lighter than air structures. Okay, so we did that in the 1783, right? So the Montgolfiers. And then in 1802 to 1880, we harnessed the power of electricity. We harnessed the power of the electron to give us energy for light. First it was DC and then later AC, thanks to Edison and then thanks to Tesla. And so we were able to have alternating current and direct current and actually light our homes at night. What it means is we didn't have to harvest whales for whale oil anymore, or we didn't have to pump it out of the ground in order to make kerosene. And so that cleaned up our environment a little bit at that time. So in 1903, the Wright brothers flew one of the Earth's first airplanes. In 1940s, computers were developed in Great Britain first, right? So that was the story of folks over there who did the Enigma machine, right? So the Enigma machine was invented by the Germans in order to send messages to their U-boat submarines. We captured one of the Enigma machines, and then through happenstance, the folks that what was his name? The guy who invented the machines for Turing, Alan Turing. Alan Turing invented the first computer to be able to crack the code, and he realized that some of the message were sent from one base to another base in Germany that said "Good morning, love," or something to that effect. And it's like "Ich liebe Sie," and they were able to crack the code in between this romantic relationship that was going on. And so computers, it was Alan Turing who first developed the computers with a whole staff at Bletchley Park in Britain. In 1969, I got to watch this on TV in black and white footage there. You can actually see the landing on the moon. Well, we had a camera that was on the moon, so that's how they got the footage there, okay? So none of this is conspiracy theory. We visited the moon in 1969. Just, get over these conspiracies. That's one of the fallbacks. You're going to set human beings behind if you believe in conspiracy theories. The next one, in 1977, we sent out a probe from Earth, knowing that it would go into outer space. Actually, it was Carl Sagan who was part of this project. They sent out Voyager 1, and today, that spacecraft, that probe, is 15 billion miles away from Earth. And so we're sending things way into outer space. And so we're going interstellar. Human beings have a destiny, and it's not just this planet. In 2010, Burj Khalifa was built, and it's half a mile tall. And that's a photo of it over here on the left-hand side. So we've done these incredible things as human beings. We're capable of the very best, and we can capable of the very worst as well, right? So what are these big hurdles that we face? And this is like the philosophical part of this context for this course. We have some big personal hurdles to overcome still. There's personal self-destructive tendencies with drugs, alcohol, and very bad decisions. just get over it. I guess it's like you're going to have to learn who you are and how to focus on the things that need to be done in order to help everybody on this planet. So, people ask you, what does it take to be a good human being? It's like, okay, live every day as though it's your last. Treat everyone with kindness and respect, and that'll get you a long way on this planet. Kindness is one of the best things we can do. Nuclear war, we have to stop that. It's like nuclear war. Nuclear weapons need to be we can't dismantle them yet because there are too many adversarial forces in this, and it actually provides a little bit of protection. But today, if Nagasaki and Hiroshima were so deadly and so bad for the folks that lived in those cities, today the nuclear weapons that we have make those look like pop guns. There's no comparison. A modern hydrogen bomb has more than 1,000 times the destructive capacity of those two bombs. More than 1,000. And the largest bomb that's ever been blown up was the Zara bomba, and it was blown up in Nova Zemlya, which is an island off the Arctic coast. It blew up, and it's just, it's like having a meteorite strike the Earth practically. It is. It's about the same, except it leaves behind nuclear fallout as well. So the hydrogen bombs don't have quite as bad a legacy as what the dirty bombs are, like the ones that are made out of plutonium and uranium-235, which makes plutonium, which causes neutrons to be released, and the neutrons destroy everything. In the modern hydrogen bombs, those are all based on fusion, and we take hydrogen and turn it into helium, and it releases an enormous amount of energy, and it's more destructive. Except it doesn't have quite as much. It takes a dirty nuclear bomb to blow up a hydrogen bomb. Let me put it that way. So there are two bombs in one, essentially, which means there are really three bombs in one, because conventional weapons cause the chain reaction to begin, and then the hydrogen bomb is the last and the final result. And they call them thermonuclear bombs because it melts everything. It destroys everything. The shock wave destroys everything. It turns everything to jelly and burns it. Nuclear bombs are a waste of resources on this planet. We are hoping to someday harness the energy of nuclear fusion in order to produce energy with very low cost, take hydrogen and turn it into something that is useful and not destructive. Fascism. I'm on my list here. Fascism goes along with tribalism. So we don't like strong men and fascists in any sort of capacity, let alone in the United States. And so it's very important for us to maintain our democracy, in my opinion, because democracy is one of the few places where you can actually have everybody have a say in how things are going to be. If you think that it's better to have healthcare than it is to have armies poised to wipe out one another, then you should probably vote. Because if fascism takes over, you won't get the chance to vote. Or if you do get to vote, there's only going to be one candidate on the ballot. So anyway, fascism is a danger. Fascism started with Mussolini in Ethiopia. Well, he went into Ethiopia. He was in Italy, right? So he was in, and then Germany. Nazi Germany was the other place where fascism first took hold. We have to stop that from ever happening again. After he left, I will leave you on this note, actually. After Mussolini led the Italians into this path, they saw that it was wrong after they got into it. They switched sides in the war. But they also invaded Ethiopia. And in Ethiopia, they were kind of brutal to the native Ethiopians at that point. And so many of the Italians were captured and put in prison camps in Kenya. In these prison camps, native Italians who had grown up in the Alps or in the Apennine Mountains of Italy looked out from their prison camp, and they were guarded by native Kenyans, who were around the camp there. And they decided they were going to climb Mount Kenya. 3 of them, I think, or 4 of them, I think, right? So 4 of them escaped camp, and they climbed a mountain. Well, what do you do when you're in the middle of Kenya and surrounded by, the colonial powers of Great Britain at that time? They decided, well, okay, we've climbed the mountain. Let's go back. And they did. And that's the capacity of human beings. It tells you that's from a book called No Picnic on Mount Kenya. They made a movie about it too back in the 1980s or 1990s. It was a really good movie too, but the book is spectacular. It was written in Italian, of course, and so it's been translated to English as well. And so in English, you can read about No Picnic on Mount Kenya. Highly recommend that book. It tells you about humanity and the best of it right there. Even when confronted with imprisonment, you can overcome that and become a hero, essentially. So any anti-democratic movements are not in the best interest of humanity. Okay, that includes collectivism. Okay, so there's a weird sort of thing going on in China that's very difficult to understand. They do have capitalism there, but it's also communism too. And so it's a weird mix between the two. And it seems to be working for them, but at the same time, there's an oppression of some of the peoples. So it's very important to have representation. And so in America today, we have a representational republic, essentially, a democratic republic. I would argue that it's probably better to have a socially oriented one, which looks out for the best interests of all humanity, like education, health care, things like that, elder care, child care, all of the things that are necessary to make civilization run smoothly. And so anyway, there is a movement today amongst the folks who have billions, the billionaire class, I would say. Many of the billionaires, especially the tech billionaires, are proposing this idea called dark enlightenment. Dark enlightenment is no enlightenment whatsoever. It takes us back to city-states. And so if you want, look up dark enlightenment in Wikipedia, and it will give you kind of a rundown. Or you can ask AI this thing, right? So that's the irony of this, because AI is probably going to be used to enforce dark enlightenment at some point in the future. But I don't know the future. I cannot prognosticate that. But at the same time, it's like dark enlightenment is something you need to be aware of, and then beware that the billionaires may try to annihilate you and me and the rest of us that are normal human beings, because they're all building nuclear bomb shelters in places like Hawaii and other places, right? So be aware that other people are planning your demise, okay? Okay, that's kind of a conspiracy theory statement right there, but be aware. It's educate yourself, I guess is what I would say. And there are certain things we just can't stand for if we want to maintain a democracy. Regardless of the flavor of democracy that you want, there are certain things that we can't do. Okay, so does your voice count right now? It should, because everybody in our country who is a citizen of this country has a right to vote. And you have a right to vote, and do not shirk that responsibility. I've taken it to heart so much, I'm actually an election judge. I go to make sure that everybody has a right to vote if they choose to vote. We have an election coming up on April the 7th, coming up here that Tuesday, the first Tuesday in April. And we are voting on a local issue. And so it's a local issue. If you live here, you're part of the solution or the response to whatever, and you get to choose. So I would encourage you to go to that election and actually participate in it. Find out if you haven't registered already. It's probably too late to register right now, but I think it has to be at least 30 days beforehand. But if you are a registered voter in the state of Missouri, in Greene County, and in the city of Springfield in particular, you get to vote for whether we have a convention center that's built in this city. So anyway, what I would say to you, and this is my last statement for this course, one of the last ones anyway, get in the game. Don't let other people run the game for you and tell you what you need to do. My wife and I do that to each other all the time, but mostly as a joke. We start out things, you need to, or you oughta, and it's like, don't let that happen. You need to think for yourself, and you need to educate yourself. And so get in the game before it's too late, I guess is what I'd say. And educate yourself. It's been an interesting journey for me. I've been teaching 2 online courses, in Geology 115 here, and then also Geology 113, which I've neglected over the last couple of weeks here, but I need to get back to that. And so I've got to close this off for now. Thank you for attention, and thank you for taking this course and letting me talk with you about the early evolution of life on this planet. Remember that it started with stromatolites and little tubular things before that, and then after that it was the trilobites and the ediacaran fauna, then the trilobites, and then the brachiopods, and then the corals, the mollusks, all these things. And then we finally got amphibians that developed out of fish, and then the amphibians developed into reptiles, and out of the reptiles came things like the mammals and the dinosaurs, and then the mammals gave rise to other mammals that became the prosimians, and so the prosimians gave rise to humans, and there's this long chain of being that goes all the way back almost 4 billion years. You're part of it, so act like it. Okay, so I guess I'll say be a part of this thing. Anyway, thanks for letting me be your instructor, and it's like I will be around. So if you ever want to shoot me an email, I'm available. So thanks for your help and in getting this thing to its successful conclusion here. You're going to have a series of quizzes and things like that through the rest of the semester and a few tests. Okay, 2 more tests. But anyway, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks now. Bye.